Okay. Well, hello everyone, and we are very pleased to be back with this new European Bauhaus Tuesday after last week where we didn't have one, and we are extremely happy to have with us Manijeh Verghese and Madeleine Kessler. I hope I pronounced it at least in a reasonable way, who are the curators of the UK pavilion at the Venice Biennale. I think and hope that many of you were able already to see the Biennale. Many of you will for sure in the near future, and they are also the founding members of Unseen Architecture, who is a studio that operates across disciplines and scales to reveal the unseen forces that shape our cities, working with local communities to give them greater agency over how they use and occupy their spaces, based in London. And we also have with us today, not Mattia, you might have noticed, but Elena Longhin, who is our link with the UK, with London, with the Architects Association in London. And she is also a PhD candidate, almost over, I think, or over. So she's a full PhD here at Iuav. So I'll give the floor to Manijeh and Madeleine, and thank them very much.
Thank you very much for having us here today. We've prepared a presentation, which we'll share with you now. And then it'd be great to have a discussion after that around privatized public space. Oh, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah. Great. So our project for the British Pavilion is called The Garden of Privatised Delights. And it's based on this painting by Hieronymus Bosch called The Garden of Earthly Delights, which I think Manijeh will talk you through a bit further.
Yeah, so The Garden of Earthly Delights is a really interesting painting that was like our main inspiration for this project. And we were really interested in how Bosch used the format of the triptych to show the utopia of the Garden of Eden or heaven on one side and the dystopia of hell on the other side. And then there's this middle ground of earth as the subject of the painting that's framed in the middle. And so to start developing our concept, we uninhabited Bosch's painting. And it kind of reveals how devoid of interest and life generic green space in cities can be without any signs of inhabitation, such as people and programming. And this brings us to our interpretation of the painting, The Garden of Privatised Delights, that translates the three panels into the utopia of the commons before the Enclosures Act of the 18th century, the dystopia of total privatization that we're worried we might be heading towards, and then this middle ground, which addresses the issue of privatized public space as an urgent opportunity to create more inclusive, programmed, and inhabited spaces. And it was really important to us that we wanted to challenge the polarization of private and public. So people often think of private as bad and public as good. And this is used as a tool to create divisions in society. And instead, we wanted to rethink how architects can work with the public to invent new frameworks to improve use, access, and ownership of Britain's public spaces.
And so I suppose, just as a bit of context as well, this painting and this triptych has been sort of a key inspiration behind our concept, but it's also been a really useful tool for us to take and have conversations with different people from different backgrounds, whether that be local community groups, landowners, developers, other architects, but to really get people to engage in this middle ground of what's often seen as a very binary and divisive debate. So it's really become this kind of tool to help us engage with this topic.
So the binary understanding of land ownership in the UK has often led to the public being seen as good and the private is always seen as bad, as I mentioned before. And while there's a great deal of nostalgia for a time when the state funded public space, what does it really mean for a space to be publicly owned? And so we found this book by Brett Christophers really influential in our thinking because it looks at the fire sale of public land by the British government over the last decades, which happened really without public knowledge. And so if our land is being sold without our consent, can it really be thought of as public? And another project which we were interested in was this project called Who Owns England? And it includes this mapping project by Guy Shrubsole and Anna Powell-Smith. And it's part of this wider research project really looking into land ownership and how we can give greater transparency to the ownership of land across the UK. And here specifically, you can see by all the red areas in the map, when they started the project, only 50% of all land in England and Wales was documented on the Land Registry's website. And now it's closer to 85%, but there's still around 5.2 million acres that still need to be registered. And even where land is registered, it's often not attributed to a particular owner. So you can see on the image on the right, a lot of the land that is registered, you can start to see that it's not even owned by companies within the UK. There's a lot of foreign investment. And so often who owns that land determines what you can or cannot do on it.
And this map called Who Owns England, it's both a website and a book, so you can go and sort of investigate it further for yourselves. But it's an absolutely fascinating mapping study, which I think we'd really recommend everyone kind of has a look at. And Guy and Anna have also contributed to our catalogue for the project. And I suppose thinking about why is this lack of transparency an issue? And it's because in the UK, like, you're often walking on public space and you don't even know who owns that space. And so this is a square called Paternoster Square, which is very near St. Paul's Cathedral. And it's publicly accessible. People sit there and have their lunch. And in 2011, there were a series of protests called Occupy protests. And these protesters sort of went into the square to protest. And at that point, it became clear that this square was actually privately owned by the Mitsubishi Estate Company. And so these protesters were told they weren't allowed to protest on this land and they had to move on. And it sort of becomes really scary when suddenly there are spaces in the city that you're not allowed to do things like protest on, that you have different kind of rules and regulations on certain bits of land that aren't clear until you break them.
And so it was kind of interesting to us to compare that to Italian public space, which has often been used as the model, or served as inspiration for many architects and urbanists, especially in the wake of modernism, looking for how to really plan our cities. And the Italian Piazza was where Jan Gehl began his ongoing research into public space, looking at how it's activated along its edges with a range of programs and how it contains lively activities at different times of the day and night. And also how it brings people together from a range of backgrounds and serves as this urban node at the intersection of many streets and routes, providing you with multiple options of where you can proceed from there. But too often when other cities or countries have tried to appropriate it, it's not been successful because they've maybe taken on too many of the stylistic elements without really thinking about the programmatic elements or how these spaces actually bring the city to life.
And also the cultural elements as to where these places are actually located. And so we're really interested in how can you start to sort of provide transparency over the ownership of public space, but also ensure that any space that is open to the public and encouraging developers to open up their private spaces to the public. How do we ensure that there are kind of a certain number of standards that everyone has to kind of abide by? And that's something that the Greater London Authority are also looking into. And last year they published this draft Public London Charter, which sort of sets out these core principles that every privatised public space that's open to the public has to abide by. So looking at things like making sure these spaces are free of charge, you know, that it's transparent what you can and can't do there, that there's good stewardship, that these places are open. And that's something that we're sort of really excited by, and we're looking forward to this kind of being taken forward, and it's something that we think sort of other cities in the UK need to adopt and could even be pushed further.
And again, the GLA, the Greater London Authority, also contributed to our catalogue, like talking about the process of putting together this charter and the kind of impact that they hope it will have across privatised public space in the City of London and hopefully beyond.
Yeah, and I suppose as well that kind of shows how when we've been exploring this project, we've been really exploring the role of the architect at every scale in the city. So how we can engage in everything from legislation and policy making right the way down to sort of detailed design of a space, and how all these different scales and moves sort of come together to allow us to start to create more accessible and inclusive spaces. And the background behind our project sort of came out of this summer school that we taught together in 2015, all about the pub. So the pub's sort of a quintessential British typology, and we were really interested in how it is a privatised public space that's often overlooked because it's an interior space. And the pub's sort of seeped in British history, sort of political groups used to meet there. It's become a place for like underrepresented groups often to meet. Sort of you have these pubs which sort of have very strong LGBTQ communities, for example. And sort of they have this really important role within British culture and society. And sort of they've over time become sort of the extension of people's living rooms. They're sort of the modern day public toilets. This is a seminar that Manijeh and I taught in the pub sort of back in 2019 for ETH. And it was amazing for the price of a cup of tea per student. You know, we had this sort of seminar space we could use for a whole morning. And so we're really interested in how the pub sort of embodies these other uses, and it's much more than just the kind of drinking hole or a watering hole. It really is this kind of community facility, but we've seen over the past few years sort of this really high rate of pub closure, because it's sort of, in commercial terms, you can make a lot of money out of these pubs by just buying and converting them into residential properties and selling them on. And there's this kind of very short-term thinking about how our cities are developing. And so we became really interested in how can we sort of save the pub and redefine it for the 21st century. And that really was our starting point into exploring privatized public space.
Which was kind of looking at how do we place value on these spaces, like some of these spaces like the pub, but other spaces like the high street, etc. Like they're really embedded in British culture historically, but they have often been overlooked or we've not invested in them. And so while the pub was our starting point, we kind of broadened out from there to really think of a range of spaces that we need to kind of care about more, and hopefully get the public to kind of intervene within as a way to open those up and use them in kind of a more diverse ways.
And I suppose also because within the UK, often people think of privatised public space as these kind of paved squares and new developments. And we were quite interested in how actually privatised public space it's not a new phenomenon. It goes back sort of centuries within our psyche in the UK, and it sort of embodies a lot of different things. It's not just about these outdoor squares. And so exactly as Manijeh was saying, we started to then look more into this topic and understand the different types of privatised public space that we could explore within this project. And we invited 6 different teams to design an installation around a topic to do with privatised public space. And 4 of those are taking kind of like physical typologies of privatised public space, which are the playgrounds, Play Without Grounds by VPPR, the Garden of Delight by our Studio Unseen Architecture, the Pub Publicani by the Decorators, and the High Street of Exchanges by Studio Polpo. And then 2 of those rooms look at the kind of policy and legislation behind public space, so the Ministry of Collective Data by Built Works and the Ministry of Common Land by Public Works. And then we're working with Museum of Architecture, our institutional partner, on a series of kind of events over the coming few months. And then, yeah, we've had some brilliant kind of consultants and our graphic designer, Kellenberger White, as well, working with us on this project. So it really has been a huge team effort to get us to where we are today. So as you enter the pavilion, you're sort of entering into that middle round of the triptych. You're entering into this weird kind of private public world that we are sort of exploring today. And you follow this garden path around the exhibition, and that garden path sort of takes you on this journey through the typical town or city in the UK to explore these different types of privatised public space. And each installation is really designed as a sort of testing ground as to how we can make these spaces more inclusive and accessible and just kind of relevant for the 21st century.
And they each ask questions that invite visitors to think about how they can use their privatized public spaces differently. So it was really important to us that we didn't, tell people how to use these spaces, but rather invite them to kind of use them in ways we never imagined. And we did that through really asking questions in each of the rooms.
Yeah, and the idea behind this path as well is that no matter how long you stay in the pavilion, you kind of, if you only want to go there for a short time, you can just follow the path and kind of whiz through all the installations. But if you want to go there for longer, you can kind of stray off the path and explore further. So it kind of guides you through. And so the first room that you enter is looking at garden squares, which are kind of this kind of very, very typical typology in Georgian cities in the UK, so like London or Bath or Leeds. They all have these kind of Georgian garden squares, which were based on Italian piazzas, but the main difference is that they've got railings surrounding them, so they can only be accessed by people who have a key, and typically the key holders were the people living in these kind of grand residential developments around the squares. Often these are no longer residential kind of places. They're often now sort of cultural institutions or architecture schools. The AA surrounds one of them. And they're just not used at all because they're very hard for people to access. And you get these weird kind of cases of everyone sort of eating their lunch sitting on the pavement around the railings with this amazing green square inside that no one can access. And in World War II, a lot of the railings around these squares were sort of removed and taken down. And you had all these amazing texts from the time by people like George Orwell talking about how suddenly you had all these different people coming to meet in these squares for the first time, all these different groups you'd never otherwise meet. And then after the war, they were reinstated, the railings were reinstated, which sort of closed them off to the public once again. And so we're really interested in how, it's such a simple move to remove some railings. It's kind of really loaded politically and really difficult to do. So how can we actually sort of transform that and change that and get everyone to see that by opening up our kind of green spaces for everyone to use, it's kind of really beneficial, not only to those who can't access them at the moment, but to those who already can, because these spaces become much more vibrant and lively and they can do more than what they're doing at the moment.
Yeah, it's worth mentioning that a lot of the research on this slide, so the George Orwell articles and some of these images are from this book called Outsider, which was part of a project that Catalina Pollack-Williamson did called Phantom Railings, which was a series of installations, but she uncovered loads of this archival research, including these George Orwell articles. And we really recommend anyone interested in garden squares to find this book and read more about it.
Yeah, so it's this book on the top left. And it's a really incredible book with a load of really interesting interviews and stuff. So definitely read it. And so as you enter the garden of privatized delights, you're confronted with this question: can we rethink what privatized public space could be? And that's the overarching question for the whole exhibition. And you're sort of confronted at the same time by these railings. So it's setting up the issue of privatized public space. You can see there's something really exciting going on behind, but you can't access it. And so you're ushered straight on into the pub. You have to explore the rest of the exhibition before you can actually come into this garden square. And the pub, Publicani, this is designed by the decorators, and it's really looking at how we can reinvent the pub for the 21st century. And the room is asking, could the pub be more than a place for drinking and become a versatile centre for civic action? And so the main structure of the pub is sort of designed at different heights. So it's really allowing everyone to come around this bar structure. And it has pieces of sort of infrastructure in it. So you can see a letterbox here. It's got plug sockets. It's sort of this bar structure, which sort of allows people to do many different things with. And when enough people come and sit around the bar, sit around the table, this karaoke plays. And it's sort of playing to the kind of tune of a Bee Gees song. And the lyrics sort of tell you about the history and the importance of pubs in British culture. And it starts to talk about how we can start to redefine them and rethink what they can become. And then there are also these kind of artifacts on the walls taken from British pubs. So these, for example, are two carpets from Wetherspoon's pubs. So Wetherspoon's is the largest chain of pubs in the UK, and chain pubs being quite a big problem actually for local pubs because they find it very hard to compete. And every single Wetherspoon's has a different carpet because they sort of design themselves. Every single Wetherspoon's is designed to sort of be locally specific, even though it's part of this huge chain. So yeah, they've sort of framed these two pub carpets on the wall.
So from there, you entered the Ministry of Collective Data, which was designed by a practice at the intersection of arts and architecture called Built Works. And in this room, facial recognition and surveillance is something that they're exploring as things that are more and more present in privatized public space. But what we wanted to really look at in this room is how technology is not inherently bad, and that the Ministry of Collective Data advocates for a more bottom-up approach to decision-making and asking for consent. And so the question that this room's asking is, can we rethink facial recognition technology and free our collective data for public benefit? And so on entering the space, you're presented with two options. You can walk left and you reserve your identity and data, and you proceed as a sort of undocumented shadow. But if you walk right, your likeness is copied by cameras, and it generates a very unique and interactive avatar, which kind of tells you what you can do with your data and how it potentially could be used. And so the ministry constructs a new type of digital public space. And it's trying to develop a fair and transparent consent-based system. So it'll offer all citizens access to their collective data and give them greater agency over how it's used. So as you move through the space, there's these like full height tree trunks that you can also hide behind if you want to prevent your avatar from appearing. And then there's also on this central totem, you can look at the screens and interact with them to understand like how much of your data is constantly being captured in the city, and then how it may or may not be used. And the avatars are designed to kind of read not just your gender and race, but also kind of data about your emotions and how you may be feeling in that space through your expressions. And so it's a kind of prototype that'll help us kind of think about the way surveillance technology is used in our cities and ways it could be used if citizens had control over it going forward.
And then you enter into the High Street of Exchanges, which is designed by Studio Polpo, who are a practice based in Sheffield. Sort of, if you look at the map of the UK, Sheffield's right in the centre. And they sort of really interested in how can we rethink the High Street to go beyond just somewhere that's commercial. Over the past year, especially, we've really seen kind of a really high rate of closure of shops on our high streets. And they're really interested in how high streets aren't just commercial centres, they're also these centres of social interaction, of care. And is there an opportunity now to really rethink our high streets to bring much more of that into them? And so on the bottom of this image is a project called Food Hall, which is based in Sheffield, which Studio Polpo have been a part of. And that's this pay-as-you-feel project. So it's a sort of cafe and also event space. And in the daytime, the cafe sort of takes waste food from surrounding other cafes and supermarkets, and then they cook with that food, and people can come and eat there, and they just pay whatever they can afford or whatever they feel. And so that kind of really means that everyone can participate and come and eat there, no matter how much you can afford. And then in the evening, sort of workshops are run, sort of dancing, everything from yoga, music workshops, and it becomes an event space. And this kind of boundary between volunteer and participant is really blurred. And that's something they've really taken through into the design of this installation, which asks, could the high street go beyond commercial interests to become a place of diverse social exchange? And so they're really looking at how do you get different people to come around a table together and come and use the high street and interact. So you enter the high street and you're presented with this ATM, which instead of dispensing money, dispenses advice. And then there's this structure which you sort of go through, which asks you to listen, to share, and to act. And so the listening part of this is really looking at, for example, when you go and get your hair cut, you're not just paying to get your hair cut, but you're also getting a conversation with someone, which can be really important. For example, for people who live alone or elderly people, that might be the only conversation they have all day. And so these cones that sit above, they each play kind of sounds and conversations from Sheffield High Street. And so a soundscape plays of Sheffield Food Hall in the central section, which sort of is this table that invites different people to come around a table and share kind of stories and things together. And then act, and there's this kind of receipt dispenser that sits on this kind of help desk, and that receipt dispenser is dispensing that advice that you've kind of asked for at the ATM. And so ACT is really inviting community participants to come and take ownership of that space and sort of, decide what they want it to be, because there isn't really a one-size-fits-all model. And so this allows it to be sort of locally specific and also evolve and change over time. And these curtains are showing kind of images from Sheffield High Streets, and with Sheffield sort of having one of the highest rates of closures of shops on their high streets.
So from there, you move into the Ministry of Common Land, which was designed by Public Works, who are a not-for-profit critical design practice. And they were really interested in how land is an endangered and depletable resource, and how it was really important to challenge its enclosure and how it's being done primarily for the profit of a few rather than for the many. And they've really explored that in lots of projects in their practice. Specifically, they've been working on an area in South London called Loughborough Junction, where they've been kind of taking over these gap sites with local community groups and turning them into community gardens, kitchens, adventure playgrounds, and thinking of ways that some of these sites that are kind of typically kept unoccupied can be better used to serve the community. And so the question that this room is asking is, can we use citizens' assemblies to develop new strategies for land ownership and use? And when you enter into the space, there's this big structure that's kind of like a mound, and that is the kind of design for a new form of citizens' assembly that is kind of challenging the traditional setup of a ministry that have, like, I guess ministries are historically set up by the Prime Minister and a cabinet. And the Ministry of Common Land wants there to be a more bottom-up approach where citizens can actually take decisions and put power in the hands of the public rather than the politicians. So there's lots of details in this room. There's a kind of ladder of participation that looks at the way decisions are made and how we move away from things being done in silos or by certain individuals in a kind of manipulative process towards a much more collaborative and inclusive response. And inside the space, you discover all these traces from the ministry's first People's Assembly, and current and future proposals for land ownership are performed on the banners across the walls, and also these symbolic architectural elements. And so this image is of, it's called a situated image, and it's part of Public Works' practice. And they were thinking of, how do you document community meetings where, often people are just sitting around and sipping cups of tea, but actually what's being discussed is so much more powerful. And so they run these workshops where people collectively make props, and then they stage these photo shoots, which are kind of like a tableau vivant, where people like enact certain historical events in the history of common land and, pose with these oversized props to kind of frame these discussions and conversations so that they can be communicated to wider audiences. So we were really excited because when lockdown eased, we were able to be part of this photo shoot that took place in Loughborough Junction, and there was like a whole host of amazing props, including these oversized paper mache heads of the kind of forefathers and mothers of common land, like Jane Jacobs and Colin Ward, and 4 of those heads you can see in the pavilion. So they're like on top of the structure, you can see in that image. But they were made by school children from School 21 in Stratford as a kind of art project. And so every part of this room, like all of the props and objects, are kind of really traces of this kind of collective conversation that needs to happen. And even the books, some of the things like Who Owns England and other books like The New Enclosure, you can see in the library. And it's meant to be this kind of resource and space of conversation to change how our land is managed.
And then you enter into Play Without Grounds. And this is designed by VPPR architects. And it's really looking at how there's just nowhere in our cities for teenagers or young people anymore. There's been a really high rate of closure of youth centres in the UK over the past decade or two. And increasingly, there's just nowhere for teenagers to hang out in. So this is looking at, can we design new spaces in the city for teenagers to occupy on their own terms? And so they've created this framework that's really inspired by the kind of forms in the Bosch painting, which I think most of the installations have also been inspired by. But yeah, this kind of spherical framework, which teenagers and young people can just sort of hang out on, and the rungs are kind of spaced out so that the higher you go, the older you have to be able to reach up there. And then there are these conversations that kind of play around the structure on speakers, which are sort of teenagers and young people talking about what they would like to see in their cities. And so it's really like, how can we design with teenagers rather than for them? Because often when people design for teenagers, they design for very active teenagers, so skateboard ramps or basketball courts. But in fact, a lot of teenagers and young people, and often female teenagers, just kind of want to sit around with their friends and hang out with their mates. But as soon as they do that, they sort of seem to, like, I know people see them as a bit of a threat and ask them to kind of move on and ask them to sort of move to somewhere else. And there's just nowhere for them to kind of hang around in. And so VPPR have been looking at kind of research by places like White Architecture Study, Places for Girls, to come up with this kind of framework which teenagers can just hang out in. You know, they can dance in the center, they can chill at the top of a structure. And it's really about not sort of telling them what to do, but allowing them to just kind of claim this framework and use it however they would like to. And then throughout the exhibition, in fact, we've got the signage, which kind of encourages you to do things. We sort of notice that in public space and privatized public space, often you're told what you can't do, but you're never really told what you can do. So this signage is really encouraging people to use these spaces in new and different ways, and to make people feel like, you know, they do have some ownership over this space, they are welcome, they can use it in all sorts of ways.
So having visited all the other rooms of the pavilion, you kind of now return to the garden square. And this is the place where everything from your journey so far comes together. And the garden square is, as we mentioned previously, is a kind of typology typically found in Georgian cities such as London, Bristol, Bath, Edinburgh, Leeds. And it's usually enclosed by terraced houses, and these squares like often lie at the center of these densely urbanized areas. But like what we really wanted to do is, when you return to the square, except this time on the inside of these railings, the question we wanted to ask is, could we open up and reprogram exclusive garden squares to create more public outdoor space? And this was really a room that our practice on scene architecture designed. And we wanted to kind of frame this as a space that's no longer exclusive and is instead transformed into a much more inclusive space as a real garden of delights. And it contains, like, so this central structure that's a kind of abstracted tree. It creates these different zones where you can do all sorts of activities, from playing to growing produce, cooking, working, meeting up with friends to have a conversation, or even just quiet spaces where you can sit and just contemplate. And that was something that was really important to us, because in busy cities, there's like no space for just to sit by yourself and sit alone with your thoughts. And greenery and access to nature was also really important. So we tried to bring these elements together in this room as a chance for you to also sit there and reflect on your experience so far and think about, what does it mean to open up these public spaces and who has access to them as a result. And so by removing the railings, I mean, you can see there's like a whole bunch of like tools for gardening and stools that use the railings and appropriate them in different ways. We want to kind of create this kind of productive infrastructure to extend the functionality of these spaces and enable people to stay in these spaces for longer and do a variety of activities. And similar to what Maddie is saying in the previous room, you know, that kind of signage that we worked with our graphic designers to develop a typeface that looks almost like someone painted it on with their fingers, as a way to suggest like individual agency, or, you know, bottom-up approach to like kind of taking control of your public spaces and determining what should happen within there. And each of these are a kind of call to arms for kind of collective action and celebration.
Yeah, and I suppose like this is where everything from the exhibition comes together, because you started off on the outside of the railings and you're now inside the garden square. And this is where all the different kind of topics and everything is coming together, from young people, from places of care and mutuality to opening up spaces to become more inclusive. This is kind of sort of where all of that is coming together. And we've repurposed the railings in this furniture, like in the stools and in the tools, to really talk about, why can't we get rid of these railings and use them in more useful ways. And then finally, there's our surprise 7th room, which is the toilets in the basement of the British Pavilion. And so what a lot of people don't know, ourselves included, is that the British Pavilion is one of the few pavilions with toilets in its basements. And we were really excited when we came over in 2019 and the Art Biennale was being installed. And we found out about these toilets, and that everyone from all the other different pavilions were coming over to use these toilets, and the British Pavilion was sort of becoming the social hub. And so we wanted to look at how could we actually open up the toilets to the public for the first time. And these are kind of pieces of graffiti that were left by the fellows as they were kind of invigilating the British Pavilion for the Art Biennale. And so this installation is asking, can we fill the void left by the disappearance of the public toilet in unique and surprising ways? So toilets have been sort of disappearing from public space, or public toilets have anyway, for a number of years due to a lack of funding. And it's really important to have publicly accessible toilets, because otherwise people are kind of chained to have to be near their homes. It's all well and good providing a beautiful publicly accessible outdoor space, but if people don't have the infrastructure to be able to use it, then they can't actually go there. And what's sort of happened over the past few years is that it's sort of been left to the private sector almost to fill that void. So, for example, pubs or cafes or museums. But the issue with that is that there's always this threshold you have to cross. So, you have to feel comfortable enough to go into a museum to use a museum toilet, or you have to be able to afford to buy a pint or a sandwich to be able to use a sort of pub or cafe toilet. And where public sector toilets are they're either closing down, or often they're just kind of inadequately designed. So often you have these sort of weight limits within them. So if you're in a buggy or a wheelchair, you might set off that weight limit and get sprayed with water and things like that. And so we think this is a really important kind of conversation that isn't really being had about why, the future of the public toilets, its importance in allowing access to our cities and our public spaces, and therefore how do we actually ensure that we are providing sufficient toilets. And so we wanted to open this toilet in the pavilion up to the public, but we were hit with a load of issues due to the Italian building regulations. So for example, the toilet's not fully accessible, and the way the system's kind of hooked up doesn't meet the Italian building regulations. So that meant that we could only put the toilet on display rather than allowing people to use it. But that for us almost highlights the issue of how much red tape there is often in allowing us to do things in our cities, and how do we therefore get that balance between regulations, ensuring that things are up to a high enough standard but not preventing you from being able to open up toilets or public spaces in new ways. And so that concludes our tour of the Garden of Privatised Delights. You can find out more on the British Council's website, where we've got like a series of films by each of the room designers about their room, and sort of fly through tour of us narrating the pavilion. But hopefully you'll be able to go and also see it for yourself, and please do send us photos if you do, because we've not managed to go yet, so we'd love to see all the photos. And yeah, thank you very much for having us, and we look forward to hearing your questions.
Thanks a lot, Madi and Manijeh, for guiding us through the installation. It's really amazing and interesting work you made, so congratulations also for that. We were really interested in learning more about the project because it surely raised and condensed many of the most urgent dynamics about appropriation of spaces and public space and grounds in the UK, but as well it resonates a lot with many others conditions in other countries and cities. And we see a lot of similarities as well with the situation of Venice, of course, which for the reasons that we know, it embeds in a way certain extremes relating to privatizations of spaces, right? So we, for example, we were thinking about the fact that similar to what happened to, if you think about, as you said, Sheffield or London in the past decade or two, there's been reappropriations of buildings and public grounds for renovations, which brought lots of positive things and aspects and possibilities to people and habitat as well. But at the same time, there has been a progressive rejections of public uses and public public activities or in the city, right? So if you think about some what became very famous buildings today, like the Fonteo dei Tedeschi, which used to be a post office and now is a commercial space. If you think about Punta della Dogana, again, for centuries, a public storage house, now art institutions, but at the same time on the grounds of the Biennale, so in the Giardini d'Arsenale, so very big spaces which have been progressively enclosed due also to the extensions of the programs of art and exhibitions like the Biennale itself. So for us, this is a really relevant topic, and I think that the case you brought and the fact that you're also running in Venice are really bringing people to the questions how much they're allowed to use these spaces. But if you think about St. Mark's Squares, you can cross it anytime during the day, it's not gated, but at the same time you are controlled about what you do there. You cannot sit and eat a sandwich, for example, right? So you cannot play ball, kids cannot really do what they instinctively would do in a public space. So one of the first questions I'd like to ask you, if there's already an effect of these overdue discussions that you are raising towards policymakers into regulations. I mean, there are certain things that, of course, might look easier to achieve, probably not on the regulation side, like the breaking of the gates. I'm thinking about Bedford Square, for example. I mean, we know how difficult is it to get inside the garden, right? So I'm thinking it might look easy to get rid of the railings, but actually a very complicated thing, right? But I'm thinking also to more complex situations, like appropriations of very open big spaces, like high streets, but also thinking, for example, about granary squares in the last few years. I mean, there's a lot of very important urgencies that we need to tackle. So I'm wondering if since the opening of the pavilion, you've been able to, or you've been invited to discuss this and how this is influencing potentially codes, regulation codes, building codes, planning, etc.
Yeah, it's a really complex issue, and I think we're really interested in the role of the architect and how the architect can play a role in bringing different people together, whether it's the public sector and the private sector. There's we were really interested in rejecting this binary of like public versus private, because there's whole degrees of privacy and publicity, as you just pointed out in some of those examples. So, we think public space is good, but then a lot of public space is currently being managed as though it's private, or it's very restrictive in terms of who owns it and what control you have over like what happens to that going forward. And then privatized public space can't only be seen as bad because a lot of that space is opened up to the public, sometimes for the very first time, like Granary Square is a great example in London of that. And so what we've really been trying to do, especially over the last year when the Biennale was postponed, was to try and start to have some of those conversations with landowners, with developers, with local authorities. We were fortunate to be part of lots of conversations through the Greater London Authority about, you know, what are the ways in response to coronavirus we can open up parts of the city, or, you know, make like suddenly, you know, parks and green spaces were so much more used because that was like one of the few places we could come together in during the lockdown. And they've been looking at cycle lanes and how to expand those. So there's lots of really interesting conversations. And what we found is that the public and the private sectors aren't saying that different versions of the same thing. But what's not happening is them coming together in one forum to have those conversations. And there's a real role for the architect to maybe facilitate more of those conversations to happen going forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you've touched upon is sort of exactly at the heart of our project. You know, how do we actually bring all these different stakeholders together around the table? Because so often as architects, we're having these conversations in silos. And so, for example, with the railings, you know, we're like, why can't we just get rid of them? Like, you know, so simple. But it you know, it might be physically simple, but we sort of operate and live in these kind of really complex systems, which make it really loaded and politically and not that simple. And we were really interested as well in how the Giardini itself, you know, it's a privatized public space within Venice. It's sort of, you know, it must be one of your largest green spaces within Venice, and it's totally inaccessible unless you have a ticket to get in. And so I suppose we kind of wanted to highlight this whole issue of these inaccessible spaces. And then through the project, we have managed to have conversations with sort of community groups, landowners, the GLA, like Manijeh was saying. And it's been quite exciting, particularly over the past year, to see the speed at which change is happening. So I think the public sector, in the UK anyway, has been very risk adverse for the past sort of few decades, increasingly more and more risk adverse, which has made them very kind of hesitant to change anything. And then suddenly over the past year, they were forced to change things. So they were forced to bring in a lot of cycle lanes at speed. They were suddenly forced to kind of bring in these kind of low traffic zones where sort of you now have these huge planters kind of put in residential streets, which prevents sort of cars from speeding down and then allows kids to use the street again as the playground. And so it's been really kind of exciting actually to see this kind of transformation in allowing communities to kind of take ownership and use their public space in new ways again. You know, sort of, I think 80% of London's public space is the street. And up until now, that's just been used, you know, it's been squeezed and squeezed. And suddenly we're now seeing streets being widened, pavements being widened because we have to, you know, for coronavirus, but actually there's therefore also an onset where you have more benches being provided in streets, you know, the pavement can start to be used as a public space once again. And there's also been sort of a lot of conversation and tests sort of run of, you know, why can't golf courses or school playgrounds be used as public spaces when they're not in use? You know, we've got all sorts of sort of open space in our cities, which has just closed off to the public and not used for much of the year. So yeah, I think we're really hopeful that change is coming. And in the conversations we've been a part of, it's really felt quite kind of exciting and positive. And that's, I think, a really important kind of distinction between the developers which are doing good things and the ones that aren't so good is whether they're long-term thinkers. And so it seems to be where people are able to think longer term. And it's the same with the government actually and policymakers, because often the government can be quite short-term thinking because they just care about their next election. And it's like where you have these kind of longer term thinkers about city making and understanding the implications long term of a small decision and what that can do to a place, is where sort of places become more successful. And it feels like people are waking up and learning to the mistakes of the past few years. So I think we are hopeful things are changing, but obviously we need everyone to be part of this conversation in order to realize that.
Thank you very much, Manijeh and Madeleine. I think it's extremely interesting, the exhibition, also having it here in Venice and in Italy, because in Italy we have this problem that we we are the model for the world for public space. Also in British culture, from Gordon Cullen to the Smithson that were here with Giancarlo De Carlo to Young L that you were mentioning. Everybody says the Italian piazza is the most beautiful public space ever imagined in the history. But we also have this problem that all these piazza are, the youngest ones are 200 years old. So our culture has not been able in the last 200 years, which is kind of a long period, to produce a quality public space. And also, sorry. Il bello della diretta, we say in Italian, the beauty of live streaming. And also, I was saying we haven't been able in the last centuries really to come up with such a quality urban space. So my question would be, if you had to give an advice to one person to start over from scratch to design a public space today, what would it be? Just one.
I think, I mean, an amazing question. I mean, if the instant thing I think of is the context. Like, look at your surrounding context, and not just physically, but like, you know, socially, historically, like the context, the wider context that this public space is acting within. And I think every single public space sort of acts as part of a network of how it's relating to surrounding other public spaces, other private spaces. And so what is the kind of role of this public space within that network? How do you work with people who live locally, who work locally, who will use the space to ensure that it kind of is working hard for all of them, is accessible to everyone, is inclusive? How do you actually respond to that context sort of socially, physically, sustainably? I mean, I think like that's kind of the biggest kind of thing to look at, and there really is no one size fits all model. It's about being locally specific, and you know, ensuring that this space, you're creating a framework that people can use in many different ways, and it can evolve over time, and you know, not being too dictatorial about how to exactly use a space, but providing that infrastructure, providing that kind of framework for people to then be able to take over it and use it in ways that you never would have imagined.
Yeah, I think a great example of this is actually, again, someone else who contributed to our catalogue is this woman, Adriana Cobo, who over the course of inviting her to now finally realizing the pavilion has finished her PhD at Central St. Martin's. But she was really using Granary Square in King's Cross in London as a test site for testing out different interventions, but also trying to make visible all of the different communities surrounding the square that don't often have access to it or can use it in particular ways. And Granary Square, for people who don't know it, it's quite a hard landscape surface, but it has these fountains. So at time, especially during the summer right now, it gets transformed into this kind of urban beach, and like loads of people from the surrounding neighborhoods bring their kids to play in those fountains. But Adriana invited like the cleaners who do this invisible labor to kind of choreograph a performance. So they made these ephemeral drawings that you could only see from above, that kind of evaporated over the course of the day. Or she invited the kind of elderly ladies who lived in nearby Somerstown to come and like yarn bomb all the hard surfaces to make like softer seating arrangements. But the whole project started because she did her laundry in the fountains in the square, and they were like lots of complaints made about, they said an immigrant was doing her laundry in the square. And while all of that was factually true, because she's like from South America, she and was doing her laundry and things like that. The minute they found out she was a student, it was okay because it was part of her like research. And so it made her realize that there's all these invisible rules of what you can and cannot do, and how could she push those further to make a truly inclusive public space. And I think that, you know, as time evolves and like as communities that surround public spaces evolve, we have to think about what are their current needs and what are the ways that lots of people can share these spaces to make them really adaptable to the 21st century.
I think that also that you, with this denounce you're doing with the installations, is actually a double denounce in a way. One is towards the public, you know, so all of us using public spaces and realizing that progressively we've been, let's say, educated or forced anyway now to certain uses of spaces, but at the same time, it's a wake-up call for designers, not for us, for architects, to be more involved into the planning processes, the community discussions, to not just come when the plot is ready to be designed, but to be within the entire process of redesigning and retaking over a certain space, right? So I think it's very interesting because it has, it really touches everyone from different perspectives.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. And I think there's a huge issue that we come to the conversation too late. So often you'll be given a site and you'll be like, why is the site even there? Like, who even made that decision? But I think it's kind of a double-edged sword, because I think a lot of people outside of our industry don't really understand what architects do or can do. You know, there's kind of this perception that we just design and build, which is part of what we do, but we are also like taught to be great strategists, you know, we're, you know, great conceptually, we're great communicators, and it's how do we actually communicate all of that to those people who are making the decisions, who are kind of making those key kind of legislative decisions, those key kind of strategic decisions. How do we convince them and let them know that it's so important to have a designer around the table at those early stages, that it's so important to be thinking about design at those early stages. And that's something I've been working with the National Infrastructure Commission's design group with in the UK, where we brought out these design principles last year. And that they're 4 principles, which sounds so obvious to designers. It's climate, people, places, value. But these principles are put in front of people who are sort of making those really kind of strategic decisions, to kind of remind them that they should be keeping these design principles in the back of their mind every single decision, every single move they're making. And I think we need to do much more of that, and much more of convincing people that design doesn't just, it's not an add-on, it's something that needs to be holistically thought of from the outset. And through our research, actually, at the National Infrastructure Commission, there was a report commissioned which found that often there's this huge perception that by getting architects or designers on board a project, it will bring a project over budget, the project will massively overrun, and it's a huge issue that that's how people perceive our industry. And in fact, there's loads of evidence to show the opposite. You get an architect or designer on board a project earlier, then that project's more likely to come in on budget and to time. So how do we actually shift that perception? How do we make people aware of that? And how do we become part of that conversation? And I think it's partly down to our industry and us telling people, but it's also about us kind of getting out there and you know, showing people and proving to them that actually this is really beneficial.
Yeah. And at the same time, I think you can also, like, in addition to operating at that strategic level, I think architects also have the ability to kind of empower local communities and kind of translate a lot of really impenetrable legislation that feels like a barrier to being able to like kind of take over a gap site, or, you know, figure out what you can do in what looks like a public space, but it's actually maybe privately owned. And so that kind of tools of communication works on both ends of the spectrum. And that's where we really see the architect as a kind of facilitator to bring both local communities and also kind of landowners and kind of people operating at that kind of strategic decision-making level together, and they kind of to meet in the middle and make more things possible.
Yeah, I mean, as a citizen, you have a huge amount of power, actually, like, and especially when you get together as community groups, you know, you have a huge amount of power, but often you don't, I mean, why would you even be aware that you have that power? Like our planning system, it's so difficult to understand. And so, like Manijeh says, it's like translating that and making people aware actually of the power that they have and how they can use that to their advantage, and how can they sort of take these tools and start to reclaim their public space. But yeah, it's about all these different facets working together.
Like, it's really interesting because again, it resonates, I think, to many other, just a story about Great Britain, but UK, but it really resonates towards many other situations. Like we in Italy experience the same conflicts every day with the planning regulations that actually tends through the code that they write to reject certain uses because of security reasons, etc., etc. So progressively, we are not allowed to convert spaces into public interior spaces, as well as we cannot make use officially of open grounds because they don't have certain characteristics, or they don't, they are not, they don't align to planning codes and safety reasons. So that's why I think it's really interesting conversations to have.
Yeah, there's a great, similar to like how our project for the pavilion grew out of a summer school, there's a great book that also came out of a summer school at the AA called Subplan, and it was developed by David Knight and Finn Williams while they were teaching a summer school with a group of students. And it started as a way to kind of draw out planning legislation to make it more visually accessible and, make it more obvious of what you could do. That's kind of written in this kind of impenetrable text. But then as they were drawing it out, they discovered all these loopholes of possibilities within that. And so it became this really important manual of almost like how you could intervene within the planning system. And maybe we need to do more of that across different contexts to open up planning and actually make people, and open up legislation to make people realize that it's a whole realm of possibilities.
Yes, this is kind of encouraging, especially again if we come back to Venice, which is a peculiar example anyway, but because we haven't seen yet a consequential attitude especially after last year, right? So we, as you would say, the high street has been retaken, the pubs have been converted into residential area because they are more profitable. In Venice, we have the reverse, right? The reverse tendency. So there's appropriations of housing for the productions of hospitality or restaurants, and this kind of conversation is not on the table at the moment among policymakers, politicians, etc., developers as well. So again, I think it's encouraging that you're actually working really towards the definitions of new codes and policies.
Yeah, how do we sort of talk about value with developers in a way where we make them see that value isn't just about commercial value? And I think a lot of the conversations we've been having have shown that people are starting to think beyond that and understanding the importance of seeing value in terms of sort of health and well-being and inclusivity. And so there does feel like there's been a sort of shift in attitude over the past year. But it's certainly, I think, this momentum that we need to keep on going with and sort of not just leave it by the wayside.
Yeah, definitely. Especially when you do, as a practitioner, you also kind of to be part of the development, or you are a developer in yourself, right? I can see, we can see in an everyday job that we actually have to explain this to people that they cover public figures and they should know already, but we actually are in this medium sort of position and try to convince people that it's for the public good, thinking about this process and how to design the spaces.
And so to keep up the momentum, as Madeleine was saying, we hope to see you in Venice, not only to see the pavilion together, but also here in the university to talk a little bit more and to design our research a little bit more, to go on with this, even maybe applying it to Venice. And so you're already invited. When they let you out of the island, you can come to this other island.
Yeah,
can't wait.
From one island to another, we can't wait. Thank you so much, and it's been such an interesting conversation. So thanks for inviting us.
Thank you.
I think we'd definitely rather be on your island right now. So we look forward to seeing you all soon. And yeah, thank you so much for having us. And hopefully we can continue the conversation and meet properly soon.
Yes.
Thanks a lot.
It's been really interesting, and we look forward. Let us know.
We will definitely. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.